Kamino is known as the home of the clones, the soldiers that made up the Grand Army of the Republic. Ever since they were discovered by Plagueis, they were ground zero for the Sith's grand plan. Dooku would be the one to find Jango Fett, and then strike a bargain with the Kaminoans after Sifo-Dyas ordered the creation of the clone army. Ever since then, Kamino was the launching grounds for the troopers that would be the namesake of the Clone War. And before it became the barracks for the Jedi's army, what kind of planet was Kamino? What type of people were the Kaminoans? Well, today, my friends, we are going to be exploring the ancient past up until now of the planet of Kamino, going through just about everything there is to know about this fascinating aquatic world. So, my friends, open up your traveler's guides and prepare for hyperspace, because into the waters of Kamino we go. The first interesting thing to note about Kamino is its actual location. You see, Kamino isn't actually in the known galaxy, but just slightly outside of it. If we were to look at a 3D map of the galaxy, Kamino wouldn't lie inside of the galactic disk or even outside of it, but rather above it. Following the Rishi Maze in the outer rim will lead you to a section of wild space which holds a dwarf satellite galaxy, one which is many times smaller than the wider galaxy we are familiar with. This dwarf galaxy is so small that it only really holds a handful of star systems in a single cluster. Within one of these star systems lies the planet of Kamino, a world which has largely been neutral, self-contained, and pretty insignificant to the wider universe for a while. Until the Kaminoans developed cloning technology, they were largely left alone. But once they perfected cloning, the Republic were not the first ones to seek out their services. But before we get into cloning, we must discuss the mythological origins of Kamino. According to the tale of Awaha Pond, the world begins with a monster god known as Protoss, a being which was truly one of a kind. He was said to wield magical abilities and to be the strongest beast that ever lived on the world. With his immense power, he ruled the seas and every creature under the water. But soon, another beast would arise and issue a challenge to the monster god for rulership over the seas. This creature was named Melkor, a dark titan dwelling in the deepest reaches of the ocean. Protoss accepted the challenge and met Melkor at the ridge of Thylina. The battle commenced and ensued for days on end, the combatants violently thrashing away at one another, wrestling and grappling, hoping to gain the advantage. Melkor sought to use both his power and size to overcome Protoss, but the monster god was too quick and agile. 7 whole days of combat would go by, the very seas themselves being rocked by the fierce struggle, until Melkor began to grow tired. Immediately, Protoss turned the tables on the dark monster and rushed him, ending his life there. It was said that Melkor's blood stained the ocean, providing food for the creatures of the sea for an entire eon. The god Protoss continued to be the king of the seas for a little while longer, until he was met with another challenge, a group of Kikla swimmers, who despite being small in stature, were great in number. They too challenged Protoss in full confidence that they could defeat him, believing their multitudes to be too great. With the Killik swimming all over Protoss, hoping their numbers would give them longevity and dominance. However, Protoss was considerably more focused than the Kikla, and they were quarrelsome and unable to unify for a dedicated attack against the god. Their bites hardly wounded Protoss at all, and he was able to successfully divide his opponents before eating them. The god of the seas successful again. The nutrition from the consumed Kikla continued to give the sea god strength as he fought what remained, and by the time the new moon rose, he had eaten the last of their number. Still, Protoss was king. Time passed, and by now Protoss had grown old and arrogant. He knew that none could oppose him as he wielded his power freely. He would soon, though, come across a pod of migration, known of the Iowa. These flying creatures that we would later see the Kaminoans ride. They were heading south for the winter, as was their custom. Yet, Protoss blocked their way and decreed that they should return north where they would freeze and die. The god's reasoning? Nothing more than it would amuse him to watch them all perish. The Iowa discussed this matter amongst themselves, and then, without issuing a challenge as the others had done, they suddenly attacked Protoss. Initially, the Iowa swarmed Protoss in much the same way that the Kikla had, and in turn, Protoss scattered them, forcing the Iowa to adopt a new tactic. Evoking Melkor, they attempted to tear at Protoss' flesh with their jaws, and despite the fact that they lacked the size of Melkor, they made up for it with their fierceness. Furthermore, they had a determination and unity that the Kykla had lacked, and so in turn, Protoss began to bleed. However, the monster god endured, and the Iowa were unable to conquer him. When Protoss exposed his soft and vulnerable neck though, one of the Iowa spotted it, and they charged and clamped down on it hard. The monster god bellowed out in pain as he felt his life force dissipating and would surely die. Using his fins, he thrashed at the lone Iowa in a punitive attempt, but it was too late. Although the lone Iowa was slain, his allies organized for one decisive final attack, and Protoss was finally killed. In the aftermath of the monster god's death, the Iowa ruled the oceans of Kamino and were respected by all for the defeat of the god, in spite of the fact that they desired no glory whatsoever and only pursued self-preservation. This amazing mythological tale would be passed down through Kaminoan heritage for generations, and would be the basis of what the people would come to believe: power through unity and preservation. Despite the oceans being the mainstay for Kamino, the planet was not always fully aquatic. It used to have dry land, and even marshlands. Some of these marshlands still exist today, but they're quite rare. But back in the ancient days, sometime prior to 19,000 BBY, Kamino was ironically mostly landlocked, with eels choking its narrow oceans and sleet-skinned mammals inhabiting the marshlands of the lower-lying continents. It was for these particular mammals that the Kaminoans would eventually arise and evolve. The Kaminoans exhibited effortless survival and movement in both land and water. In the beginning, they built massive cities on the coasts, with the largest and most popular being the city of Derem. Within the city, they built fantastic structures such as the cloak spires of Harien Nova, but soon, all of them would become buried in the tragedy of 19,000 BBY, as an abrupt climate change suddenly caused the mass melting of Kamino's glacial reserves. Within 200 years, every landmass of Kamino was buried in hundreds of meters of water. The Kaminoans wasted no time during those 2 precious centuries though. Armed by the values given to them by the tale of Iowa Pond, they preserved and built cities on stilts in this brave new era. With their brilliant minds, the Kaminoans would advance their technology until they reached perfection in the cloning science. Using this technology, they were able to clone the extinct species that had drowned in the wake of the mass climate catastrophe. In the wake of the Great Flood, the people used this technology to even clone their own species to ensure their survival. This would lead to their culture becoming more and more uniformity and reaching perfection. Soon, Kaminoan cloning was the finest in the galaxy, beating out literally all other competition. People would come from all around, commissioning their cloning services to create workers or even soldiers for warlords. Although the Kaminoans were highly xenophobic, they reluctantly complied with working with outsiders so that they could trade their cloning services for necessary imported supplies and goods. And speaking of the Kaminoans themselves, they were mostly defined by their slender appearance, calm and pleasant demeanor, and their long necks. But while these are the things that humans and other species would notice first, the Kaminoans were more focused on the eyes of their brethren. The large eyes of their heads were usually dark and were suited for seeing in the murky depths of the water. They could see on the ultraviolet spectrum, which is actually why Tipoca City is completely white on the interior. In fact, this only appears white to humans and many other species, and the colors of the interior are painted with an ultraviolet spectrum and can only be seen and admired by the Kaminoans. But it was the actual eye color of their people that mattered to them the most. Whatever color their members were born with determined their caste that they would eventually be placed in. The highest level caste had gray eyes, and they served as administrators and operators of the facility. The middle caste were the golden eyes, and the lowest castes had blue eyes. The castes determined not only their social ranking, but also the job that they would have on Kamino. What's fascinating is some Kaminoans were born with green eyes. However, they were viewed with disdain and were killed shortly after birth, viewed as an abomination. The Kaminoans hated anything less than perfection and constantly strived towards it. This is why they moved with such elegance and grace and spoke so softly. They believed themselves to be the pinnacle of beings and viewed all other beings as lesser. Though they did respect any being that tried to improve themselves. Any species that refused to improve though, they saw as worthless and garbage. However, Despite their intense xenophobia, they were always polite to outsiders, mostly because they took such great pride in their scientific exploits and advancements. Since their cities were mostly made of giant laboratories and facilities, the Kaminoans sank themselves into their work in perfecting the cloning science. They were a reserved people that rarely showed their true emotions. When they did, it was in a dance known as the Nahara that simulated a ballet. Although force sensitivity was extremely rare in the Kaminoans, and to our knowledge there was only one of their species that became a Jedi, Master Kin Ha was a Kaminoan who became a Jedi during the Republic Classic era before the Clone Wars. She was a wise master who strictly adhered to the code of the Jedi, but rarely ever visited the temple. It was because of this distance from the main Jedi Order that she managed to survive Order 66, hiding out on Mandalore during the reign of the Empire. The Kaminoans, though, viewed Kin Ha as a monster since she could touch the Force and none of them could, viewing this as a breach of perfection. The end of Kamino's history and the collapse of Kaminoan society happened at different periods depending on which continuity you explore. In canon, the Bad Batch explored how the Empire secretly ordered the bombardment of Tipoca City to fully end the Clone Trooper project. While many Kaminoans died, others were given offers to join the Empire and use their experience and scientific knowledge to serve the Emperor. In Legends, the end came in 12 BBY, when some disgruntled Kaminoan scientists attempted to revolt, making a counter-clone army to fight the Empire. The 501st was sent in, led by Boba Fett, in order to shut down the entire operation. During the battle, almost all of the Kaminoan cloning facilities were destroyed, and many of them were massacred. In 4 ABY, Kaminoan society tragically collapsed after the fall of the Empire. Though many were still around and would end up helping out during the Yuzhong-Vong War, this would be the end for most of Kaminoan culture. But anyway, my friends, this is just about everything we know about the history and the society of Kamino. Tell us, had you been interested in the planet before, and what other planets would you like us to explore their history and society? Let us know your choice in the comments down below. And as always, my friends, may the Force be with you, and I hope you're having an incredible day.